It is time to begin seeking excellence.
All right, so many of you know that the average listenership, or I should say the age range of the average listener of Seeking Excellence is, I think it's like 80% of you are 18 to 34, which is awesome. Shout out to my old heads. If you're over the age of, I don't know, 50, 60 and you listen to this, we love you. And if you're younger than that, that's even better. I think you're getting a head start on a lot of this stuff, which is super great. But if you're in that age range of 18 to 34, you've heard of self-esteem before. You know that you and I are in the self-esteem generation. Millennials, and I think it's trickled down and really even amplified in Gen Z, this idea of self-esteem, which I did some research on. I came across this article on a magazine called The Cut. Now, this is not a promotion of The Cut because I have not seen anything else that they produced or put out. So I don't think that I'm advocating for this, but I'll put the link to this article in the notes if you want to check it out for yourself. It was kind of hard to tell because it seems like they cover like fashion and all kinds of other things. They're out of New York. And so I was like, man, I wonder if this is going to be like a pretty woke take on self-esteem. Because again, I've started all this thinking about this from a number of different things. The first was, again, that talk that I witnessed of Jason Craig's, where he shared that there is no such thing as self-esteem. There is only competence, right? And so I really was moved by that. I really was like, that's a really interesting thing. And I think that that's largely been my experience, which I'll share about in a little bit. But I wanted to do some research on self-esteem, especially because a recent chapter that we went through in book club with the Screw Tape Letters talked about humility and this idea of false humility that so many of us are prone to. And he talks about how the devil really wants us to fall into this trap of false humility. And so thinking about all of this, I was like, this would be a good time to learn a little bit more about self-esteem. And so what I really appreciate about Jesse Singal, who wrote this article, is that I don't know if it's a man or a woman, to be totally honest with you. Let me scroll to the bottom and see if I can find a picture. It's a very long article, and I did not read all of it. But what I appreciated about good old Jesse here is that they went through and gave some explanation on the history of where self-esteem came from. And this is really a thing. I mean, we all know this wasn't a thing, right? In the World War II generations, right? Or like the baby boomers. And I think there was something to like the hippie generation, that everything was love, everything was good, everything was positive, that really kind of lended itself towards the creation of self-esteem. And so with self-esteem, basically, we see that there's this increase in the late 80s. There was a book published by this politician and social worker that put out a book that talked about self-esteem and how good it was. And basically their hypothesis was that if we start to tell people that they're good and help people to feel good about themselves, then we will lower crime. We will have a better society, etc. It was called The Social Importance of Self-Esteem. And it was the kind of groundbreaking first thing that really came out about this. And I don't know how to say the guy's last name that wrote it, Vasconcello. And he basically put together this commission in California that did a bunch of research. And what they basically said was they didn't find very much, right? They tried to do research and tried to it was one of those classic kind of, and I think a lot of sociology works this way, where you basically create a conclusion and then you try to find things that support your conclusion, right? That's often how it goes. Not always how it goes. It's often how it goes, where you're trying to find things. And so they didn't really find that much, but it said that this idea had kind of gotten started by accident, and then people were seeking a way to affirm it. And we have this another thing here. Deputy Attorney General Brian Totter said, "I've read hundreds of criminal files on criminals." And he said some people end up in a life of serious crime simply because they dislike themselves. And that's what they're basically arguing, is that they think that a lot of negative behaviors that exist in the world are all rooted in the fact that people dislike themselves. And so self-esteem is kind of defined as that. How do you evaluate your self-worth? What do you mean to yourself? Do you find yourself to be a failure? Do you determine that, or call yourself a bad person? All these types of things, which I think is really interesting. And I always have thought it was really interesting. This concept that we're all good, we're all special, we're all talented, and we're all not that we're not. I won't say we're all equal, because we obviously are all equal in dignity before God, but this kind of desire to even the playing field constantly. And throughout my life, I've come to see that I believe what Jason Craig said, that self-esteem doesn't really exist. What we have is competence. But I've also come to believe that this idea of self-esteem and this kind of desire to equate everybody and make everybody the same really lends itself towards socialism. And where I think that comes is most obvious is the difference between equality and equity. Equity being we all have the same outcome, equality being that we all have the same opportunities. Now, one of the key things, I think, one of the key moments, one of the key features of the self-esteem generation, which I am nevertheless proud to be a part of because I love my millennials. One of the key features that we all remember is our participation trophies, right? So if you were of the self-esteem generation millennial and you participated in sports and things like that, then you know that we were all about some participation trophies. Now, we weren't personally. I think most of us kids hated them, but we all got one at one point or another, right? And what was the key idea of the participation trophy was, yes, everybody competes, everybody tries their best, but everybody deserves a trophy at the end of the day. And the debate at hand is that true, right? This is the debate that society has had. A lot of people, typically more conservative, push back against that. And why is that? I think that's because largely that's exactly what equity is. Equity says no matter if you work hard, no matter what kind of effort you put in, no matter if you risk anything, you deserve X, Y, and Z. More than that, you are entitled to X, Y, and Z. And I think that there's got to be a strong correlation. I think there's a causal relationship between the level of entitlement that we see today and this idea of self-esteem being so promoted to our generation. Because of the fact that it started in the early 90s and really worked its way into schools, where it was just everybody's special, everybody's important. I think there was this shift in society where we started to really embrace what the hippies had wanted to create, right? Which is this everybody, you don't need to work, you don't need to contribute, but you do need to receive, right? You're entitled to receive. And that's obviously heavily problematic. And I think that there's something good. There can be good-willed people who want to promote the idea of self-esteem. I think that that's certainly something that's possible. It's easy to recognize that, yes, self-esteem may be problematic, and when it's promoted to make you feel good about self-esteem is most problematic when it's used to make you feel good about things you should feel bad about, right? You have this. I talked about this a little bit, and forgive me if this was a book club thing or if I said this on a podcast recently, but I was really moved recently watching a clip of, I think it was a commencement speech by Dave Chappelle. He was talking about how there's this move in the world to take things from being good and bad, right and wrong, to being better and worse. And you can really see that, I think, right now with the Israel-Hamas situation, there's this resurgence of people like feeling bad for Osama bin Laden. I don't know if you've seen this online, but there's like Osama bin Laden back in like the early 2000s or late 90s wrote this letter to America pre 9/11. And there's like this resurgence of Gen Zers who are like, commiserating and showing compassion for 9/11 because they have bought into Osama bin Laden's philosophies and his ideas that they were oppressed, that we were oppressing them, we're colonizers, etc. Now, there's a lot there that you could dive into that's really interesting, but and namely, what I mean by that, just to not be too vague, is one of the things they complain about the most is the exportation of American values on Middle Eastern countries. And what they mean by that are not the conservative things, because most practicing Muslims are pretty conservative, at least socially speaking. They're talking about the things that liberals advocate for, right? They're talking about things that progressives advocate for. Women being dressed any sort of way in the streets. There are certain things that both conservatives and liberals advocate for, like women being educated and having equal rights. Then you also have like the whole LGBTQ push. We spend billions of dollars trying to promote trans ideology and LGBTQ ideology in the Middle East. And it's like, okay, now that if you want to talk about something that seems reasonable to be upset about, you could get me on board with some of that. But that's not what these progressives, they just have this crazy idea that we're trying to force democracy on these other countries, which some of which is true, but some of which is not. I think we've learned some lessons about trying to force democracy in places that it's not wanted. But it's really interesting to see that you see that people are able to, have compassion and empathize with these horrible causes. Why? Because, like Dave Chappelle said, there's no such thing as right or wrong anymore. You just have kind of good and or better or worse. And so that's where self-esteem, I think, gets in the most danger, is when you start to have people who are living actively sinful lives, actively harmful lives. And we say, no, I know it seems sinful. I know it seems bad. We don't really believe that anymore. We shouldn't be so judgmental in them. You should still feel good about yourself. A great example of this is the concept maps, right? Which some, I think, LGBTQIA plus include people like this in there. What is a map? It's a minor attracted person, previously known as a pedophile. But we stopped calling pedophiles pedophiles. Why? Because we want to call them minor attracted persons. Pedophile seems harsh, seems derogatory, right? Where else does this start to come about? Fat phobia, fat shaming. Think about this. Fat shaming and bullying people, making them feel terrible about themselves, not a good thing. We all agree with that. Bullying is bad most of the time. But this idea that your doctor shouldn't be able to tell you you're morbidly obese, that you might need to make some changes for your health, that is a symptom of self-esteem. And that's where self-esteem goes wrong. This idea that you should feel good about yourself no matter what. And there's just times and circumstances where you should not. And we've all been in those times and circumstances, right? I remember back in the day when I was living a very party, pleasure-seeking, just sinful lifestyle. There was times where I would celebrate my sins, as many young men do, many young people do in general. You brag about how drunk you were, or how high you got, or who you hooked up with, whatever it is. I'm not supposed to feel good about that, right? Like there are just times where you shouldn't feel good about the things you do, namely when you're doing bad things. But we wanted to avoid any negative experiences. We wanted to avoid any negative feelings. And so that gets us into some very dangerous territory, which we know. But a lot of people still kind of promote this idea that we should have self-esteem. You should feel good about yourself all the time, no matter what, no matter who you are or what you're doing. Now, you can see how that doesn't incentivize competition. It doesn't incentivize people to want to be better, because what we see now in a lot of millennials and just in today's world in general is that when you tell people they're good no matter what, you start to see people not try to be good anymore. Because there really is something to earning positive emotions, positive feelings, rewards. There's something to earning that trophy. And I think there's some beautiful life lessons that when you don't earn the trophy, when you don't win the game, there's still something pretty awesome about the fact that you gave it your all, and this time you just came up short. But you still have something you can strive for in the future. But let's say you half-assed it, you know that, and you still walk away with the same trophy that the people who busted their tails got. I think that there's just something inherent in us that knows that this is wrong, that knows that this isn't a good thing. This is not a good system that we've set up. And what you start to see is you start to see people have this false confidence in these different areas in life. And of course, the false confidence also leads to entitlement, because entitlement requires self-esteem. Entitlement requires a false confidence. What I would call a false confidence is having a level of confidence that doesn't match your competence. Because if you're not good at something, but you think that you are, that is in and of itself, I think by definition, a false confidence. And we don't, I think in the church, the crowd that I'm speaking to for the most part probably struggles a little bit more with false humility than with false confidence. Because I think false humility is running rampant in the church. I think it's very, very common. I've come across it many times in many forms. And that's not good either. And I'm going to get to that next. But developing a false confidence and encouraging people to have a false confidence is not helpful. I've seen a lot of changes in um, parenting philosophy as well that I think is kind of returning to a happy medium with this, right? Because you did have generations before that were just like, basically just shitting on people, right? That was just like anything you do wasn't good enough, um, tearing people down, like very negative. And that's obviously not good. That's obviously not what we want as Christians, right? We shouldn't want that for society, for people just to feel shitty about themselves no matter what they do. That's not healthy. And I'm seeing this change, I think, in a lot of parenting philosophies where you start to applaud people and start to affirm people's efforts rather than their results. And you start to applaud and affirm their efforts rather than telling them that they have certain qualities, right? Because what this means is like, it's like instead of, if you're doing math homework with your kid, instead of telling them, hey, you're really smart, look how you got that done, you say, wow, I'm really impressed by how hard you worked to get to that answer. And you talk about the process more than the outcome. And you talk about the process more than you talk about attributes that you're assigning to this person. Now, I've seen this many times with many, I think, I think many parents that have done the opposite of this throughout time. I'll never forget. I mean, you guys, you know that I am pretty straightforward, right? And rather blunt. I just remember being a kid and listening to parents or family members talk about how smart a kid was that I knew was pretty dumb. And if I knew the kid was pretty dumb when I was listening to his parents talk about how smart they are, it started to make me think like, man, are my parents lying to me? Is my mom lying to me about some of this stuff? Is she hyping me up? Am I being gassed? And you just see it, right? Because every parent thinks they have the cutest kid, the smartest kid, the best kid, the kindest kid, etc. in the world. And this is a part of parenting. Now, I'm not mad about that because I don't think Jordan's the cutest kid in the world, but I do think he's top 5, top 10 on a bad day. And I don't know how smart he is yet. We'll wait and see. But I'm hoping not to overhype him up in this regard, because what I think it does do when you just assign these attributes to people is what the philosophy that I've read in a lot of these parenting books and leadership books and things is that when you start to assign to somebody, hey, you're so smart, you're so smart, you're so good at this, is that when they struggle with something, they start to question their entire identity. Because if your identity is in being really smart, then you kind of have this feeling like you shouldn't struggle with school. I think this happens super often because we know that there's times where all of us, right? Like everybody, except for the kids that are really struggling, everybody's got good grades in like first and second grade, right? And then you got like third grade, fourth grade. Like I was on honor roll until I was in like sixth, seventh grade, eighth grade, maybe. And then I started to struggle a little bit because shit starts getting real when you're in, middle school and high school. And that's where you really start to see like who's balling and who's not. So if you've been told for 6 years that, hey, every time you got an A or a B, you're so smart, you're so good at this, you're so whatever, and then you get to algebra and you're like, oh shoot, this is hard. I think it starts to impact your confidence, your ability to say, hey, not just struggling to believe in your competence, but starting to struggle to believe if you're even capable of growing, right? If you're capable of improving and increasing your competence, which I think is a very dangerous place to be, because it's one thing to sit there and think, man, I'm struggling with this, or I am not competent, I'm not good at this thing. But if all of your identity is wrapped up and all the things you've been affirmed in is just how natural things come to you, and something then doesn't come naturally, you're going to struggle. And you're going to struggle big time. It's going to impact your mental health. It's going to impact your view of yourself, etc. Rather, if you have the opposite of that and you start to say, and you affirm in your own life and you're affirmed by other people to think and say, man, I am a really hard worker. And they say, look, notice how you didn't know how to do this and now you do. Think of how much you've grown and changed and made improvements. right? That's what people start to think. And so it's a huge shift. It's a shift in perspective. It's a shift in the way you view your struggles. And when you come to obstacles and hardships, even rejection at times, right? You can start to say, hey, I've been rejected before, but I'm affirmed and confident in my ability to overcome this. Not just confident in my natural skills to be able to adapt and pick things up naturally and easily. That's a huge difference. And so that's where I think we also start to make this mistake is when we start to tell people that they're special and they're good at everything. Sooner or later, you're going to realize you're not good, right? Like if you keep hyping things up, like there's at some point, and usually it comes in adulthood, right? Because once you get into the marketplace, there's just no benefit for a company to tell you that you're good and pay you more than you're worth. Right? And so you get into this marketplace of ideas. Same thing with like even doing this. Like if you start creating content or doing whatever and people don't like it, then if you've been told all the time that you're good, everything comes so easy to natural, whatever, it doesn't feel good to fail. It doesn't feel good to fail regardless, but it especially doesn't feel good to fail if you've always had the assumption that you were going to succeed, that you were born to succeed. That just makes it all the more difficult to face these challenges. And so we have to be careful with this. And I wonder, doing some reflection in your own life of what are you confident? What are you most confident in? And how have you allowed this idea of self-esteem to really impact you? Because the idea still exists out there that for the best thing we can do for our mental health is to have high self-esteem. And what I found in my life, I think women can, from what I've seen at least, embrace this idea a little bit easier, but I don't think that men can almost at all. Right? Like I remember in my own life, like when I had confidence and I wasn't actually good at stuff, like that contradiction was incredibly painful and not something I was able to just like overcome and get past. And this is something that I don't know if this is something that's unique to me or if this is more common amongst men in general. But I think the reason what makes me think that it's more common in women is that I think so much women's ministry is geared at just telling women that they're good, they're special, they're beautiful, they're loved. I need to know that I'm good and special and loved as well. We need to recognize and embrace the love that God has for us. We also, being Catholics and not humanists, recognize that we're fallen, we're prone to sin, and there's ugly sides to us as well, which is something that is also anti self-esteem, right? In self-esteem, it's very humanistic. It believes that humans are inherently good and that they're corrupted by the things that happen to you in your life, but you are inherently good. And Catholicism, Christianity teaches the opposite, that you are inherently fallen and you need God's redemption and grace to be saved, to be on this path of salvation that can over time refine you and make good out of you. But this is my struggle I have with some ministries. And like I said, I think it happens a lot in women's ministries where it's like, you're amazing, you're so great, you're so this. And it's like, you might not be, right? Emily, we were just watching a reel the other day that was talking about how like some parenting styles are better than others, because this is especially common amongst in motherhood. And I get it, because motherhood is so difficult and it's so draining and it's so challenging and it's hard to know if you're doing a good job and you don't get the immediate results and all of that. But there does seem to be so much motherhood content that is like, hey, no matter what you do, you're doing your best and you're amazing and you're good at this. And it's like my like pessimistic side of that is just that, do you see the world? Do you see the people we're producing? You think that all of these parents are parenting well? And this isn't a shot at mothers. It's the same thing for fathers. I wouldn't believe anything that told me that no matter what I'm doing, I'm trying my best and I'm fathering well. This is not necessarily true. It may be true in my case, but it's case by case. You can't just blanket say that all parents are doing their best. They may be doing their best, but they also may be doing their best. They may be putting out all of their effort, but still doing it in the wrong directions. I would say that the vast majority of parents are doing exactly that, because the vast majority of parents are not raising their kids in any faith. And to me, that's an immediate fail. Like if there's certain things, right, that like when you do PT tests, let's take for example, in the physical fitness test in the Army physical fitness test, not the new combat, whatever the hell they're doing now, that has like 52 events. It's like a decathlon. But the one I used to do was push-ups, sit-ups, and a 2-mile run. If you just do just sit down on the 2-mile run for the next 2 hours, you fail the whole thing. You don't just fail the run, right? You would say you failed the run, but you failed your PT test if you just failed one of the things. And that's how I feel like parenting has to be to some degree. If you raise your kid and they have no morals, you failed. Doesn't matter how hard you tried, doesn't matter how many jobs you worked, doesn't matter how much money you had, what you provided to them, what kind of schools you afforded them to go to, doesn't matter what schools they got into, what career they got. If they are an immoral person, then you fail at parenting. Now, I think there's something to be said that if you failed at parenting, you don't fail at life. Doesn't mean that you're a terrible person, doesn't mean that you're going to hell, etc. But there is something to a lot of times when you find kids who are grown and not practicing the faith anymore, usually there's a reason. There are very rare examples that do exist where you have parents that absolutely crush it and are doing all the things. Dad is leading the faith. Dad and mom are both active in going to mass. They talk about the faith at home. They have books and spiritual books, and they're growing and they're involved, and they're loving parents that challenge their kids, inform them, and educate them in the faith. They're the primary educators. They embrace that role. They do all of those things, and the kid still rejects the faith. That is a real possibility. It's a scary and real possibility for parents. And I think a parent like that who might have still failed in some degree, right, because of the result, can still be proud of the work that they did, still feel good about the parenting that they did, that they gave their child, and they can pray for the coming back. But I mean, if you want to talk about like percentage of parents that are in that group in America, it is very, very small. And then to think about how many kids are still leaving the faith, like most of us are not that. Because why? Because most parents do not take the role as being the primary educator of their child, not even just for the faith, but in general. They don't think that it's their job to teach their kids morals and responsibility. They allow sports to be God in their household. They allow these other things to happen. They give their kids phones and TikTok at 9 years old, at 10 years old. If you're doing those things and your kid is living a godless life and grows up to have horrible mental health, a ton of health issues, and is obese and overweight and super unhealthy and all these things, you're going to tell me that you're going to sit there and tell a mother or a father, hey, you're doing your best. Hey, bud, you're giving it your all. Don't be so hard on yourself. No, maybe you need to reevaluate. You might need to be a little hard on yourself. That's just a reality. But this is where we're coming. I'm not surprised to see this kind of content coming from parents, millennial parents now, because that's what we do. That's what we were trained to do. It's just feel good no matter what we're doing. And so we have to evaluate in our own lives where this may have taken root, where this may be taking place, and where we just be letting ourselves slack. Because I know in my life, I find myself, having weeks where I'm unmotivated to work, unmotivated to do certain things, and I just feel entitled. This should be done for me, or I deserve this time off, or I deserve this. And there's times where you do, right? I'm taking all of next week off, and I'm super grateful for it. Thanksgiving week, I have the whole week off, got some extra paternity leave. And that's a beautiful and wonderful thing. And I've been working really hard, and I'm still going to be recording and doing other stuff. So it's not like I'm going to be, just laying on the beach all week. And there's times to balance this, right? Because we can't be too hard on ourselves. But I think this all kind of comes down to what I talk about with a lot of these kind of generational differences is that the pendulum swings and it goes too far in one direction, too far in another. And so our grandparents were raised in this, like, we're too hard on ourselves, we're too harsh. Dads can't tell their sons that they love them, right? They have no emotions, no feelings. To now we're in this totally other side where we're totally effeminate, totally soft, weak, self-esteem, feeling good about ourselves when we ought not to, etc. And it's our job to get back into the middle. And it's our job to find that virtuous mean, that virtuous middle where we can recognize that we need breaks, recognize that we're human, recognize that we are good and that Christ lives in us, that we are baptized sons and daughters of God, that we get to commune with him in the Eucharist, that we get to partake in building up the kingdom of God on earth. All these things are good and wonderful and beautiful, that God took time to create us, that God felt the world needed one of you. And so he took the time to make you, and he gave you to your parents. and you were one of the greatest gifts of their life, whether or not they realized that, whether or not they appreciated it, you were still one of the greatest gifts in your parents' life. And all this is good and beautiful and true. What's also true, not good or beautiful, is the bad and the ugly, is that you choose to reject God. You choose to neglect your prayer life. You choose to make unhealthy decisions consistently over time that leads to an unhealthy lifestyle for your physical body that God has entrusted and given to you as a gift. You choose to half-ass it at work. You choose to be frivolous in your spending, to not be generous with your money, whatever it might be, right? I'm not trying to just bash you down. I'm giving examples and really thinking of things that I do. That's how I came up with that list. And if that's all true as well, we ought to recognize the balance of these truths and not act like we can't just have one without the other. And this is where the idea of false humility often comes up, is we like to think of, we can fall into this trap, which I've never understood because I don't get how people look at your life. I don't understand. I don't get it's, I'm trying to figure out what I'm thinking here. So sometimes like three things will come to mind at once. I don't get how people can look at the world, can look at the Rocky Mountains and not believe that there's a God. I don't get how you can see a beautiful sunset and not think about God and the goodness of God. Similarly, I don't see how you can see the good things that you do, the good things that you have, the good things that have been given to you, and like barring a chemical imbalance in your brain that like truly makes you depressed, I don't see how you can only think negative things about yourself. I've just never understood that. I see that even if it's just my dog some days, I make her so happy when I come home, right? And I think that you start to see a reflection of your goodness in other people if other people value you. Now, if you're a child growing up in a home with a very abusive mother or father or both, and you're neglected and they hate you and they're cold towards you, then it makes sense. And if you're coming from that type of an environment, then it makes sense. The vast majority of us, thanks be to God, are not. And so I don't get falling into that other side where you only think the bad things about yourself. Even I was having a conversation with somebody recently, and she was probably 60, if I had to guess, maybe in her 50s. And she was telling me about how she does religious at her parish. And she was trying to tell me how she's really trying to instill in the kids that God loves them, of course, which is great, but that God is not this angry God that's counting all of their sins and all the bad things that they do. And how like she was raised with all this Catholic guilt and she wishes that she hadn't fallen away or that she had had some of these resources a lot of young people have today when she was young. And I was thinking to myself, like, well, I mean, to an extent, God does count our sins, right? Like, why else do we? I mean, most of the guidance I've ever received when it comes to confession is you should list your sins and list how many times you've offended God by committing those sins specifically, if you know them, right? Um, so this idea that God is like never mad at us is also not true. It's also not the gospel. Um, so there's a balance there, and we have to recognize that. But I don't get how we can only focus on that because we know that we have a God of mercy, of love, of beauty, and truth. And I don't get how you have Catholic guilt and get so negative and so down on things and you come and look at the crucifix. If you spend 15 minutes just looking at the crucifix and pondering the fact that Jesus would have died if only for you, if you were the first person to have sinned in the history of the world, Jesus would have done what he did, been poured out. I'm looking at the crucifix on the wall behind the camera. Jesus would have done what he did for you. How do you hate yourself? If Jesus Christ, the creator of the universe, the king of all creation, loves you that much, how do you have the audacity to hate yourself? That's why hating yourself is a sin, right? Because it doesn't make any sense. It's a rejection of reason. It's missing the mark. That's exactly what sin is. And so we can't do that. You can't have those things simultaneously. We have to recognize our goodness and we have to encounter and face our badness as well so that we can strive to change it, to tone it down, to be careful, be cautious of it, all of that. So all of that's really important. All of that we have to balance. And so we don't want to have this false humility that the devil wants to get us into, which we learn in the screw tape letters, The devil wants us to have this false humility where we, you know, are attractive and try to pretend like we're ugly, or we're talented at something and we try to pretend like we're bad at it. And we have this kind of false humility that we think, oh, I'm being really humble. I don't want to be cocky. I don't want to be arrogant. And so I'm just going to act like I'm bad at things that I'm good at. That also doesn't make any sense. I'm not saying that you should go and do that because that's stupid. I'm saying that you shouldn't care about any of this because none of this matters. None of what you're good at matters. None of your attraction matters. What matters in life, and this is what I'm really coming down to, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and I continue to refine my message and my voice in the world and what I want Seeking Excellence to be and all of that is just such a work in progress. It's been 3 years, and I feel like every 4 to 6 months, I'm like rediscovering it all. But if I could have like one fundamental message from today that I've been working to get to for 40 minutes almost, so thank you if you've been along for this ride, is that most of the shit in life doesn't matter. Almost nothing does. I mean, very few things. If you think about it, the things you watch on the news, the things you scroll about on social media, almost none of them are of any real importance or any eternal consequence. What matters is that God loves you and how you respond to that love. Whether you reject it, whether you embrace it, whether you encounter it, whether you strive to live by the commands that Christ has left us with. And I don't mean to say commands. Commands is not supposed to, it has such a negative connotation, which I think is ridiculous. But I mean commands in that he gave us commands on how to live our lives, on how to love one another, on how to care for one another. And when we do that, that's when we're at our best. That's when we're thriving the most. That's when we experience the most joy. And that's when we're going to get the most out of life. Jesus came that we might have life, that we might have it to the full. And so having self-esteem, feeling bad about myself, or I feel so good about myself because I did X, Y, or Z, great. If you want to, do it. I like to reflect back and rejoice and have a dessert or a drink after we hit our sales goals for the month, or after something fun happens, or after we achieve a goal in the family or whatever it is. That's all good. It's good to celebrate those things. But ultimately recognize that they're all fading away. It doesn't matter. And what matters the most is the things that are of eternal consequence. God wants us focused here on the present and on eternity. And in this present moment is where time touches eternity, because this is what we can control. This is when we can connect with God. This is when we make the decision of who we're going to be tomorrow, a week, a month from now, 5 years from now. It's the decisions we make now, the things we choose to think about, the things we choose to look at, digest, people we spend our time with, etc. And so I just want to encourage you in that self-esteem is bullshit. Keep that in mind. And most things in life are BS and don't really matter. What matters is your relationship with God, how you love your family, how you live out your vocation, and if you're responding to God's call for excellence and holiness in your life. So let's go out there. Let's get to it. God bless you. Greatness is a habit. Never forget that, and be your best.